What if the person you trusted the least turned out to hold the one truth that could shatter everything you thought was real? In the grand halls of the Harrington estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a maid who had spent nearly a decade scrubbing floors and dusting chandeliers finally stepped into the spotlight. Grace Miller, quiet, overlooked, invisible to the billion-dollar family she served, was hiding a secret that could destroy their empire or save it. And when she decided to speak, nothing would ever be the same again. If you enjoy powerful stories like this one, filled with shocking twists and hidden truths, then you belong here. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story. Every day, a brand new tale awaits you. Grace Miller slipped past the east corridor of the Harrington estate with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned to make herself smaller than a shadow. The Silver Room, an almost ceremonial vault with paneled oak walls and a scent of lemon oil, breathed a cool hush that swallowed footsteps. Dust motes hung in noon light like slow-falling confetti, catching on the polished backs of antique tea services and engraved trays stamped Harrington, 1926. The hum of the climate control whispered over her arms. The metal in here always felt alive, faintly cold, as if it remembered every grip of every generation. She set her caddy down, microfiber cloths folded in perfect squares, bottle of polish labeled in black Sharpie, and listened for the distant cue of the courtyard fountain. 3 steady spurts, then silence. That meant Eleanor Harrington had retreated to her study for calls. 10 minutes, maybe 12, before the next roaming patrol from security. "Make it quick, Grace," she murmured to herself, a habit from years of coaching courage out of thin air. She tugged at the bottom shelf of the tall armoire, the one that always stuck like a stubborn jaw. It gave with a wooden sigh, revealing the usual lineup of velvet-lined cases, each holding flatware heavier than her monthly rent. But behind the last case, hidden where only a hand small and insistent would go, her fingers brushed cardboard. Not a Harrington velvet, not an inventory tag. A plain, old shoebox taped at the edges, the kind you keep under beds when you're 20 and broke. Her pulse skittered. "This isn't on the manifest," she said, and the words felt like a draft slipping under a locked door. She eased the box onto the runner and sat cross-legged, the carpet whispering against her jeans. For a second she simply held it, feeling how light it was, how wrong it was, like finding a paper daisy among crystal. She checked the door, ajar by an inch, and listened for the house, the faraway knock of a contractor's hammer, a maid's muted laugh in the back hallway, the soft ping of an elevator arriving 2 wings away. You don't keep secrets in a room built for display, she thought, the line arriving as if narrated by someone older and braver. With a fingernail, she split the tape and lifted the lid. A breath of old paper rose up, dry ink, attic musk, a faint ghost of perfume that didn't belong to Eleanor. On top lay a folded receipt, its edges singed with time. Bank of America, Midtown Manhattan branch. Beneath it, a rental agreement for a safe deposit box signed not by a Harrington, but by Bayshore Holdings LLC, an entity Grace had never seen on the staff compliance posters. Her mouth went dry. "Shell companies are like well-pressed suits," she remembered a groundskeeper once saying, half joking while pruning a hedge. "They look sharp and hide a lot of mess." She thumbed further and found a photograph. Richard Harrington Sr., decades younger, tie loosened, sun in his hair, shoulder to shoulder with a woman Grace didn't recognize. The woman's smile was soft and quiet, the kind that isn't for cameras. In her arms, a baby with knit brows and a tiny fist pressed to his cheek. On the back, in careful handwriting, "For you, so you never forget that love isn't a contract. L.B." Grace's breath snagged. L.B. Laura Bennett. The name surfaced from somewhere in the estate's rumor water, one of those whispered shapes you never quite see. She looked again at the baby's eyes, wide, storm grey, a touch of defiance tucked in the corners. and a shiver rolled through her. There was someone else in this story, not a vendor, not a donor, not one of the conveniently vague family friends. Someone whose absence had been tidied away like crumbs brushed under a $10,000 rug. Outside, a golf cart buzzed past the hedges. Inside, the clock on the mantel ticked with the delicate arrogance of old wealth. If this box exists, she thought, what else in this house has been mislabeled as silver? Footsteps, 2 sets, stirred the corridor. Grace slid the lid on, heartbeat hammering in her neck. She shoved the box behind the case, but the velvet tray refused to sit flush now, as if the room itself wouldn't tolerate the lie. A knuckle rapped lightly on the open door, and Charles Whitmore's voice, all courteous edges, drifted in. "Ms. Miller? Quick question about the service inventory. We're tightening controls." His silhouette angled in the doorway, flanked by a younger security aide whose earpiece blinked a soft blue. Grace smiled the smile she reserved for these men, warm enough to disarm, bland enough to be forgotten. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore," she said, rising smoothly, palms unconsciously brushing invisible dust from her thighs. Whitmore stepped onto the antique runner and scanned the cases like a man rehearsing ownership. His cologne, a cedar spice canopy, overwrote the lemon polish and made Grace's skin prickle. "You've worked this room a long time," he said, conversationally. "You'd be the first to notice if something moved." The pause on moved was too casual. A little theatre to remind everyone who signed paychecks. Grace tilted her head, folding calm around her like an apron. "Only when the house decides to breathe, sir. Wood swells, hinges, gossip." The security aide smirked. Whitmore let it pass. His gaze snagged for half a beat on the lower armoire. Grace followed his eyes, felt the room balance on a wire, and then, blessedly, his phone vibrated. "Excuse me," he murmured, stepping back into the hall. "Eleanor?" "Yes." The call pulled him away. Grace exhaled as he vanished, the quiet rushing back with a cool kiss. She knelt, slid the velvet tray properly, testing the edge until it clicked into a semblance of obedience. A decision formed itself in the space fear had occupied. This box couldn't stay here, but it couldn't simply vanish either. Not with eyes in ceilings and logs in servers. She pulled out her notebook, cheap spiral, the kind no one in this house would steal, and copied the safe deposit number, the LLC, the branch address, her handwriting, tidy from years of writing chore lists and reminders to breathe, filled the page. She tucked the notebook into her apron and, with a final wipe of polish, restored every surface to a gleam that insisted nothing had ever happened. On her way out, she passed a mirror, a tall, foxed thing that had reflected 4 generations of Harrington posture, and hesitated at her own faint image. Hair tied back, shoulders square, eyes alert in the way of people who learned early that rooms can turn against you. "Invisible doesn't mean powerless," she told the woman in the glass, a phrase she'd started planting in herself like herbs on a windowsill. As she stepped into the corridor, the house shifted registers. The elevator chimed. Somewhere Ethan Harrington laughed a little too loudly at something he didn't find funny, and a tray clinked in the kitchen where someone who would never taste the gala menu arranged smoked salmon rosettes for people who would barely look down at them. Grace took the servants' stairs to the back landing and paused at the narrow window. The lawns rolled out in a lake of manicured green, dotted with white event tents like upright ship sails. Beyond the hedges, Long Island Sound blinked with afternoon light, boats skimming like polite secrets. She texted the only person who would read between her words, Mrs. Margaret O'Donnell, her neighbor in the modest apartment building off Sound Beach Avenue, who had once been a nanny in a Fifth Avenue household and knew the taxonomy of rich people's lies. Working late. Found something. Can we talk tonight? 3 dots appeared. My porch. 7. Bring your brave face and some tea bags. Back in the hall, footsteps approached. Lighter, hurried, more uncertain than entitled. Ethan turned the corner and almost collided with her, then caught himself, the automatic apology already on his lips. "Grace, sorry, didn't see you." He tried a grin, the kind you put on like a tie, and failed halfway. Up close, the resemblance to the baby in the photograph wasn't evidence, wasn't proof, but it wasn't not something either. The storm-grey eyes, the way his mouth rested as if braced for impact. "No harm done," Grace said, stepping aside. He hesitated, as if there was something else he wanted to say that didn't have a safe path to daylight. "You ever get the feeling," he asked quietly, glancing toward the silver room, "that this house keeps secrets better than it keeps people?" Grace's hand tightened around the caddy handle. Somewhere, a mantel clock chimed the top of the hour, neat and final. "All houses do," she said softly. "This one just has better lawyers." He huffed a laugh, grateful for the pressure valve, then nodded and moved on, the back of his suit jacket catching light in a brief silver strip. Grace watched him go, the photograph pressing against her memory like a note under a door. If the silver room had given her a thread, she knew better than to tug without a plan. Threads, after all, don't snap alone. They unspool sweaters, then closets, then the entire brand of a family, accustomed to thinking truth is something you pay to curate. She turned toward the service elevator, breath slow, decision firm. The elevator doors closed with a hydraulic kiss, and in that sealed hush, Grace let the thought complete itself. Bayshore Holdings, Bank of America, Midtown, L.B. The box in Manhattan was no longer a rumor or a ghost. It was an address. The doors slid open on the lower level, cool air snaking across tile, the faint clatter of pots in the distance like distant artillery. She set the caddy down, pulled her phone, and opened a map. The branch was walking distance from the 51st Street station. She could take an early train if she swapped her Tuesday shift. It would require precision, a favor, maybe a lie that wouldn't injure anyone she respected. "You can dust a truth forever," she thought, "but it still leaves a fingerprint." She tucked the phone away, squared her shoulders, and headed for the staff office to study the rota, every step a quiet vow. The porch of Mrs. Margaret O'Donnell's duplex smelled like Earl Grey and rain-damp wood, the kind of evening perfume that made secrets feel less sharp. String lights, half the bulbs blown, looped lazily between two posts and cast a weak amber halo over a pair of creaking rockers and a small table that had seen 1,000 cups. Grace climbed the 3 steps with the careful tread of someone approaching a confessional, her tote bag bumping against her hip. Across the street, sprinklers ticked in synchronized arcs, the lawns of Sound Beach Avenue glistening as if the neighborhood were trying to rinse itself clean. "You look like a woman who has found a live wire and is wondering whether to pull," Mrs. O'Donnell said, pushing the screen door open with her elbow, tea kettle sighing in the background. "Sit. You're rattling my porch boards." Grace sank into the rocker and watched the older woman orchestrate the ritual. 2 blue mugs, lemon slices in a chipped saucer, a tiny honey bear with a dented cap. The kitchen window framed O'Donnell's profile, white hair pinned in a forthright bun, the posture of a retired general who had chosen a floral apron as her final uniform. When she returned, she set the mugs down with deliberation. "The way you place chess pieces before a decisive opening. Now, then," she said, lowering herself with a quiet groan, "tell me what the rich have thrown in your lap today. And don't spare me the ludicrous parts. Those are my dessert." "I found a shoebox in the silver room," Grace began, heat blooming slow in her cheeks as the sentence left her. She told it all in a steady spill. The Bank of America receipt from Midtown, the safe deposit under Bayshore Holdings, the photograph of Richard Sr. with a woman whose smile didn't belong to cameras, the baby with storm-grey eyes, the inscription on the back, "Love isn't a contract." Initials L. Bidet, she finished, wrapping her hands around the mug as if it were the first warm thing she'd touched all day. And Whitmore came sniffing not 10 minutes later, like the room had tattled. If that box is a thread, Margaret, it's tied to something that doesn't want air. Mrs. O'Donnell's eyes sharpened, the kind of bright that made people underestimate how much she knew. Bayshore Holdings is a coat hanger name, she said, almost to herself. You hang whatever you don't want wrinkled in public on it. The photograph, she tapped the rim of her mug, considering. There was a woman, years back, before you. I was nannying uptown then, but did weekends in Greenwich. Good money, terrible manners, not a staff roomer quieter. Her name was Laura Bennett. She and Richard ran hot for a year just after his engagement. Sweet thing, Laura. The kind of smile that shows up even when she thinks no one's looking. Then, she snapped her fingers softly. Gone, like a book taken off the shelf and misfiled where no one will find it. Grace tasted metal in the back of her mouth. Laura Bennett, she repeated, the syllables slotting into place like a key turned twice. Do you think the question snagged on the night air, too large to swallow, too dangerous to finish? She tried again. The baby, the eyes. Ethan, the name wove out uninvited, and she felt disloyal for saying it, as if the porch itself might carry sound to the wrong window. Margaret watched her with the compassion of someone who had once loved a child who didn't know where he belonged. Children inherit more than cheekbones, she said softly. They inherit unfinished conversations. If Ethan walks like a question mark, it's because someone replaced his period with an ellipsis. They sat with the line a moment, listening to the street sigh, the distant commuter train, the soft scrape of a neighbor dragging out recycling, a dog shaking tags into the dusk. Grace told her about Whitmore's inventory theater and Eleanor's tightening of controls, about the event tents sprouting on the lawn like agreeable mushrooms. They're pulling the drawbridge up, she said. Either they feel a siege coming or they're planning one. Mrs. O'Donnell snorted. When the rich talk about efficiency, they mean quiet. When they talk about security, they mean don't ask questions. But a shoebox in a silver room. She pointed with her chin toward the dark line of the Sound, where a single boat light blinked like a polite warning. That's not an accident. That's a message someone wrote to the future and hoped the right hands would read. Grace pulled the notebook from her tote, flipped to the page with the careful copies. Bayshore Holdings, LLC, Safe Deposit, NUC, Bank of America, Midtown Manhattan Branch. She slid the notebook across. The old woman put on glasses with the gravity of a magistrate and nodded slowly. This branch will open at 9. You could be on the 612 into Grand Central. Walk up to 51st. You'll need something more than guts. She lifted her gaze. Do you have any right to that box? The word right hung between them. A moral hinge. Grace swallowed. Legal? No. Ethical? She glanced down at her own handwriting, small and tidy like a schoolgirl's. I clean their truth. Every day. I carry more of it than they do. Then you don't go alone, Margaret said, voice practical as a grocery list. You bring a hand who doesn't spook easy. You bring a second pair of eyes, and you bring a string you can pull if the room starts closing. She reached beneath the side table and produced an old manila folder, the kind with coffee rings fossilized in the corners. Inside, tucked between recipe cards and electric bills, were photocopies of articles. Harrington Foundation announces record philanthropy, Eleanor Harrington hosts Gala for Children's Health, and, older, a grainy society page with a photo, Richard Sr., jawline like a promise, and beside him a woman captioned family friend. Even abused by newsprint, Laura Bennett's soft smile radiated. I keep souvenirs, Margaret said, not apologizing. Sometimes the past needs an archivist who isn't on payroll. Grace felt the world tilt as the picture from the shoebox and the one in her lap overlapped in her mind. The baby in the first, the missing in the second, the yawning blank where a person should have been written into history. She thought of Ethan in the hallway, barely breathing under the weight of a suit he didn't choose. "If this is what I think it is," she whispered, "the house has been living on a story with a chapter torn out." Mrs. O'Donnell patted her knee, then put the page back. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "One more thing. Call Catherine Johnson in the morning. She teaches AP Government at Greenwich High, and she owes me for a babysitting swap I never collected on. She knows her way around records, corporate filings, public disclosures. You'll want someone to button up whatever you pry open." They planned it in the humble warfare of bullet points. Grace would trade shifts with Alma in laundry for Tuesday. Margaret would text a retired doorman who could identify the kind of ID protocols Midtown branches favored. Catherine would scour the state filings for Bayshore holdings at dawn. "When your heartbeat is louder than your plan, rewrite the plan," Margaret said, sliding the manila folder into Grace's tote as if passing a talisman. They hugged at the door, the way women do when they have both carried too much for too long. On the walk home, hydrangeas along the fence exhaled a sweet, damp breath, and the moon put a pale nickel in the sky. In her apartment, Grace laid out clothes with military precision and set 2 alarms, the old wind-up and her phone. Sleep, when it came, was a thick river she kept swimming across with the word Bayshore stamped on every current. At 5:07 a.m., coffee chimed, and the shower steam wrote private weather on the bathroom mirror. Grace braided her hair tight, workday practical, and pulled on a navy blazer that made her feel like a steadier version of herself. The train platform smelled like wet metal and paper cups, commuters gathering in the choreography of routine. She texted Margaret, "On my way, and Catherine, need a quick search on an LLC, can I call from the city?" and tucked her phone away like contraband. When the 612 slid in, its doors sighed as if it were as tired of secrets as she was. Grace found a seat by the window. Greenwich unspooled into Stamford, then Norwalk, then the silver sliver of the Sound, and the industrial backyards of a city that believed in becoming. Her notebook sat open on her lap, pages brimming with tidy lines that felt, for once, like a blade instead of a broom. Grand Central hit her with its cathedral of motion, light pooling off gilded ceilings, announcements stitching through the air like thread pulled by an invisible hand. She walked, letting the city's purposeful current carry her, the navy blazer and neutral flats making her look like any of 100 assistants on errands for bosses with bigger names than spines. On Lexington, bakeries exhaled butter, and Manhattan exhaled taxis. Grace turned west at 51st and paused on the corner opposite Bank of America, Midtown Manhattan branch, where reflected sky slid down a facade of glass and steel. Inside, people queued in quiet snake lines. A guard with a face like a locked drawer watched everything. Grace touched the notebook in her tote and thought of Laura Bennett's soft smile, of Ethan's unspent laughter, of a photograph signed like a promise. She inhaled once, the kind of breath you take before you jump and trust the water to remember you are mostly made of it. The lobby of the Bank of America branch on East 51st smelled faintly of marble dust and printer toner, a cool blend of old money and new paper. Fluorescent lights hummed like patient insects above a checkerboard of polished tile, and the air registered at the exact temperature where people don't complain. Grace crossed the revolving door in her navy blazer, becoming one more anonymous current in the quiet river of customers. A security guard with a face set to neutral watched the room with the stillness of a statue, earpiece pulsing a soft blue. Posters promised clarity, control, confidence, in fonts that had never seen a late fee. She rehearsed the plan once more, ask, observe, adapt, and felt the anchor of her notebook in the tote, its neat lines suddenly heavier than silver. At the information desk, a woman with lipstick the color of cranberry glass smiled a professional smile that had survived 1,000 Mondays. "Good morning. How can we help you today?" Her nameplate read R. Santos, Client Services. "Safe deposit access," Grace said, letting her voice land somewhere between efficient and unremarkable. "I'm here regarding Bayshore Holdings, LLC. There was a note sent to update our authorized users, and I'd like to verify the box number before we waste the compliance team's afternoon." The sentence walked the line between truth and theater, borrowing cadence from 100 overheard Harrington calls. Santos's smile didn't falter, but Grace caught the flicker of appraisal. This woman knew the difference between bluster and fluency. "Of course," Santos said, tapping the keys with the music of someone who understood that the world moved by spreadsheets. "Do you have identification and the key?" Grace slid her driver's license across, Connecticut, current, and set a small velvet pouch on the counter. The key inside chimed lightly when she tipped it into her palm. Flat, brass, stamped with a number that matched her notebook, found taped inside the shoebox lid like a secret that had changed its mind. A text buzzed in her tote. Catherine Johnson, Bayshore registered in Delaware. Manager, Seacrest Corporate. No human names on public record. I'll dig for banking relationships. Grace typed back with 2 fingers under the counter lip. At branch now. Will stall as needed. Then smiled again at Santos, who had finished the first movement of her search and modulated into the second. Bayshore Holdings, Santos repeated, shifting to a tone people use for delicate glass. I do see a safe deposit box associated with that entity. I also see that access requires 2 factors today: physical key and authorized signatory or power of attorney on file. The words laid themselves like thin sheets of ice, clear and treacherous. Grace breathed through the pause that wanted to become a tremor. "That's consistent with what I was told," she said easily. "I should have a limited authorization letter on file for vendor reconciliation. May I speak with a vault officer to confirm the internal note?" She didn't press. She invited. The difference often decided whether a door closed politely or opened a few inches further than policy intended. They waited through a small silence, shaped like policy, while the floor's soundscape held its steady, civic hum, the slow rise and fall of a copier, the polite murmur of tellers, the distant elevator's bell. Santos made a call. Phrases like client rep and authorization check floating in the air like soap bubbles that wouldn't pop. A man in a dark suit arrived from a corridor marked Safe Deposit and Private Banking. He was mid-40s, handsome in the resigned way of people who iron their days. His badge read J. Halpern, Vault Officer. "Miss Miller," he said, and extended a hand with clean, precise fingers. "Let's step back where we can look this up without the whole lobby listening." He smiled as if to soften the implication that no one trusted anyone until the screen said so. The corridor muffled the city. Framed photos of turn-of-the-century vaults lined the walls, sepia men in hats pretending money was romantic. In a small glass-walled office, Halpern gestured to a chair and sat opposite. His monitor reflected twice in his glasses. "So," he said, tone neutral as water. "Bayshore Holdings. We keep conservative records on safe deposit relationships. Tell me what you're expecting to see, and I'll tell you if the world is as tidy as we dream." Grace matched his tone with careful candor. "I'm cross-referencing permissions. The last internal note I have mentions a pending update to authorized representatives to avoid delays with vendor doc storage. The key is current." She set it on the desk with a delicate click. "If there's a missing letter, I'll fix it before anyone loses a day, because I guessed wrong." Halpern studied the key like a physician checking a pulse, then the screen like a priest reading a confession. "You do have the right key," he said finally. keys being the only democratic thing in the room. As for authorization, the account lists Seacrest Corporate Services as manager and one individual, added many years ago by in-branch notarization. He hesitated, a line forming between his brows. That individual isn't a Harrington. Grace's heartbeat ascended a rung and paused on the next landing. "Is the individual Laura Bennett?" she asked, keeping her voice soft, like one does with news that may break a life or mend it. Halpern blinked slowly, not surprised enough to be annoyed. "You already know more than most people who ask me for things," he said. "The name on record is indeed Laura Bennett. The note says any change in authorization requires her physical presence or a court order." For a moment the office tilted, not with shock but with the quiet relief of a conjecture becoming a fact. Grace nodded, as if this simply aligned an internal spreadsheet. "Then I'll need to do this by the book," she said. "Is there a way to request a courtesy check, confirm the contents were catalogued within the past decade without opening the box?" Halpern considered her like a teacher considering whether to let a bright student break a rule to prove she knew the rule. "We don't catalogue contents," he said. "We catalogue attempts, and the last recorded access was 12 years ago, same day the authorization was added." He leaned back. "Look, Miss Miller, I'm not your adversary, but in this office I'm a locksmith who only turns keys the right way. If Miss Bennett appears, you'll have no delay. If she can't, you'll need the courts." Grace let the word courts sit on the table between them, heavy as an anvil, and thought of Eleanor's talent for making process into a moat. Her phone buzzed again. Catherine got a hit. Seacrest Services Entities for Whitmore Holdings, a feeder structure tied to Harrington Capital projects. "That CFO of yours plays on many teams. Call me when you're outside." Grace slid the phone face down, and when she looked up, her expression contained more resolve than disappointment. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Halpern," she said, rising. "One last question. If an authorized individual believes their access may be obstructed by interested parties, can the branch flag the account for protective verification?" Halpern's mouth tugged into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We can flag for in-person ID regardless of who calls. The vault isn't a rumor mill. It's a place where facts get a fair chance." They shook hands. In the corridor, the sepia men in hats kept pretending money was poetry. Grace walked back into the lobby, felt the city's vibration find her again, and only then allowed the plan to pivot. She could not open the box today, but she had the names braided now. Laura Bennett on the authorization, Whitmore near the manager, Bayshore as the coat hanger. The story wasn't locked, it was latched, and latches could be lifted from either side if you were patient or lucky or both. Outside, Manhattan exhaled in yellow cabs and steam vents. Grace stepped into sunlight that bounced between glass towers like applause and called Catherine, who answered on the first ring. "You were right," Grace said without preamble. "Laura is on the box, and Whitmore has his fingerprints on the LLC's skeleton." Catherine's voice came quick and caffeinated. "Then you need Laura, and you need to assume Whitmore will feel the tremor the second anyone jostles that box. You've got to find her before his lawyers do." Grace looked up and watched a flock of pigeons flip the air into confetti. "Mrs. O'Donnell said Laura vanished like a book misfiled on purpose. If she left a forwarding address, it's not with the Harringtons. Start with public records on her last known employment, lease, any non-profit affiliations. I'll head back to Greenwich before the house notices the gravity shift." Catherine hummed. "I'll also pull Whitmore's philanthropic boards. Men like him hide in committees. Oh, and Grace," her tone softened, "you're walking a high wire. If you slip, don't do it alone." Grace ended the call with a thank you that carried more gratitude than words, and stepped back into the revolving door. The guard's neutral face remained Switzerland, the city, unabashedly itself, poured into her eyes and ears until she felt steadier again. In the reflection on the glass, she caught her own outline, small, composed, the kind of woman lobby cameras never bothered to zoom on, and let a small, private smile touch her mouth. She had come for a key that opened metal. She left with a key that opened movement. When she reached Lexington, her phone vibrated one more time. A new message from an unknown number. Ms. Miller, this is Charles Whitmore. I'd like to discuss your compliance inquiry. Lunch at the Plaza tomorrow. Call it a show of efficiency. The quotations around compliance glowed like hazard lights. The Plaza Hotel glittered like a diamond, catching every light of Fifth Avenue. Its chandeliers burned with the stubborn brightness of old money, and its marble lobby smelled faintly of polished brass and champagne that had soaked into the walls over decades of celebration. Grace arrived in a navy dress borrowed from Mrs. O'Donnell's niece, simple but dignified, paired with shoes that pinched slightly, but gave her stride an extra inch of authority. She carried nothing but a slim clutch and the armor of her own composure. Around her, the gala unfurled in waves of silk gowns, tuxedos with satin lapels, laughter sharpened by martinis, and the soft rustle of donors congratulating themselves on generosity measured in commas. A string quartet floated something by Vivaldi into the golden air, as if money and music had always been cousins. Charles Whitmore stood near the center of the ballroom, a man who looked like he'd been sketched directly from the word entitlement. His tuxedo was blacker than the piano lacquer, and his smile had the precise wattage of a campaign billboard. When his eyes found Grace, they didn't widen with surprise. They narrowed, calculating. "Ms. Miller," he said smoothly as she approached, "I was beginning to think the invitation had been misplaced." He extended a glass of champagne, which she declined with a smile so small it could have been mistaken for shyness. "I don't drink while I'm working," she said, "and tonight I'm working harder than usual." Whitmore's laugh was the kind men use when they want to sound amused instead of irritated. Always professional. That's what I like about you. The Harrington family hovered nearby like planets around a sun. Eleanor Harrington, in emerald silk that shimmered under the chandeliers, moved from group to group, dispensing words like currency. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, restless in his bow tie, looking like a boy trapped in a costume he couldn't breathe in. When his eyes met Grace's, there was a flicker of recognition, the kind that passes between soldiers on different sides of a war who both know they're pawns. Eleanor intercepted him with a hand on his shoulder, steering him toward donors with the precision of a general deploying troops. Grace caught fragments of her voice. Legacy, responsibility. What your father built. Ethan nodded with the mechanical politeness of someone counting exits instead of compliments. Whitmore guided Grace toward a quieter alcove, lined with portraits of mayors and presidents who had once toasted beneath these chandeliers. His voice dropped to a tone polished for negotiations. "I'll be direct. I know you've been sniffing around Bayshore Holdings. I know you visited the bank, and I know you've spoken to Katherine Johnson, who, though admirable, is not immune to mistakes." He let the words settle like coins clattering on marble. Grace studied his face, the way the candlelight picked out the silver at his temples. "Mistakes like yours?" she asked softly. "Because the only error I've seen is assuming no one would notice a box that holds more than documents." Whitmore's smile faltered for just a second, enough to prove she'd struck something solid. A waiter drifted by with a tray of oysters, and Grace took one, letting the silence stretch while she tasted salt and lemon like truth sharpened on steel. "You're bold," Whitmore said finally, voice slipping toward irritation. "But boldness without protection is recklessness. I can make your life easier if you step aside. The Harringtons don't need a maid who thinks she's counsel." Grace placed the empty shell on the tray and met his eyes. "And they don't need a CFO who launders their legacy into offshore shadows." The difference is, my loyalty is to the people, not the balance sheets. For a moment, Whitmore's mask cracked. The man behind the smile looked less like a financier and more like a gambler whose cards had just been glimpsed. Across the ballroom, a hush fell like a dropped curtain. Eleanor Harrington had taken the stage near the grand staircase, her voice amplified just enough to float above the string quartet. "Friends, benefactors, pillars of our great city," she began, her tone blending warmth with iron. "Tonight we celebrate not only our history, but our future. The Harrington name has stood for excellence for nearly a century, and we will continue that legacy with transparency and integrity." Grace felt the irony sharpen against her ribs. Transparency had never been less transparent. Ethan shifted near the stage, his jaw tight, hands flexing like a man rehearsing an escape. His eyes flicked again toward Grace, a silent plea, or perhaps a warning. Whitmore leaned closer, his cologne a mix of cedar and control. "Don't even think about speaking out here. These people don't want truth. They want spectacle, reassurance, a story that makes their donations feel holy. If you interrupt, you'll be out of Greenwich before dawn with nothing but a story no one prints." Grace smiled, not with defiance, but with patience. "Stories find their audience," she whispered, "even the ones powerful men try to bury." At that moment, a microphone squealed slightly, the kind of imperfection that draws every eye. Eleanor steadied it with practiced ease, but the silence that followed was fragile, waiting for someone to decide what came next. Grace stepped forward, her heels tapping a rhythm on the marble floor, and felt the room inhale. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let it carry. "Mrs. Harrington," she called, every syllable balanced between respect and revelation. Heads turned, whispers rippled, and Ethan froze mid-breath. If transparency is the theme, perhaps tonight is the perfect time to discuss the assets hidden in Bayshore Holdings. Because integrity isn't measured in speeches, it's measured in the secrets we choose not to keep. The air cracked. Not with sound, but with silence so loud it pressed against the chandeliers. Eleanor's smile thinned, Whitmore's face hardened, and Ethan's eyes widened like a man who had just seen the first stone fall from a wall he'd always assumed was indestructible. The ballroom at the plaza did not applaud, did not laugh, did not even breathe for a full heartbeat after Grace's words. The chandeliers hummed above like galaxies frozen mid-spin, their prisms catching the weight of the moment. Donors glanced at one another with the desperate politeness of people who want permission to react, but don't yet know what the reaction should be. A violin string snapped somewhere in the quartet, a high-pitched cry that sliced through the hush. Then silence returned, thicker than velvet. Eleanor Harrington stood at the podium, her fingers tightening around the microphone stand until her emerald rings dug small crescents into her skin. "Grace Miller," she said at last, her tone like silk stretched over steel. "Our loyal employee has chosen an unfortunate moment for theatrics." Grace didn't flinch. She stood with her hands at her sides, posture balanced as if the marble beneath her heels belonged to her. "It isn't theatre," she replied, her voice steady but not loud. "It's truth. And truth has no good timing because it doesn't ask for permission." The murmurs rose like wind, stirring through tall grass, some skeptical, some intrigued, some sharp with gossip. At a side table, a shipping magnate whispered to his wife, who pursed her lips in a way that suggested scandal was the spice she had been craving all evening. Whitmore moved quickly, sliding through the crowd with the oily grace of a man accustomed to plugging leaks before they became floods. His smile returned, but it no longer reached his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice smooth as varnish, "let us not allow an ill-informed staff member to cast shadows over decades of honorable service to this city." Ethan shifted, his jaw tight enough to ache. He watched his mother's hand rest possessively on the microphone, her emerald dress blazing like armor. He also saw Whitmore's hand gesture subtly to a server, a code meant for staff to escort Grace out. Ethan's chest tightened, an urge to act, a fear to stay still. His reflection in the ballroom's gilt mirrors seemed to ask, if not now, then when? Across the room, Mrs. O'Donnell had slipped in unnoticed, wearing her good Sunday coat, eyes sharp despite her age. She caught Grace's glance and gave the smallest nod, the kind only women who'd survived storms could give. Stand firm, child. Storms pass, but truth doesn't drown. The server approached, tray trembling in his hands as though he'd been asked to clear away dynamite. Grace turned before he spoke. "Don't," she told him softly. "This isn't your fight." The young man froze, then retreated, cheeks burning. Whitmore's smile cracked at the edges. "You're embarrassing yourself," he hissed, low enough for only Grace to hear. She leaned in just enough to make her reply intimate and lethal. "Better to embarrass myself with truth than to bury myself in your lies." His hand twitched, wanting to grip her arm, but he thought better of it. Too many eyes, too many phones already raised discreetly, recording history disguised as scandal. Eleanor raised her voice, her tone slipping toward command. "Enough. This evening is about philanthropy, not slander. Mr. Whitmore has been our trusted partner for years. I will not allow baseless accusations to disrupt—" She stopped mid-sentence because Ethan had stepped forward, his bow tie loosened, his face pale but determined. "Mother," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "she's not lying." The sentence detonated more forcefully than Grace's entire speech. Gasps rippled through the ballroom, cameras pivoted, whispers turned into a collective roar. Eleanor's composure fractured for the first time, her eyes flashing not with disbelief, but with betrayal. "Ethan," she breathed, "you will not speak against your family in public." But Ethan's words came faster now, as though a dam had burst. "Family means honesty. Family means protecting the name, not laundering it through shadow companies. I've seen the accounts, Mother. I've seen the transfers. Bayshore Holdings isn't a rumor. It's real, and it's dirty." Grace's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to leap into the fire so soon. The donors leaned in, riveted, their expensive jewelry catching the trembling light. Whitmore's face drained of color, and Eleanor's lips thinned into a single unforgiving line. The quartet had stopped entirely, bows lowered, as if music itself had decided it was safer to remain silent. Grace took a step closer to the stage, her eyes meeting Ethan's in the space between them. It wasn't alliance yet, but it wasn't opposition anymore either. It was recognition, two truths colliding into solidarity. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, her voice steady as a gavel, "your son just confirmed what I began. You can call me disloyal. You can call me presumptuous. But you cannot call both of us liars." The room buzzed, heat rising with every breath, the scent of perfume and fear mixing into something intoxicating and sour. Cameras clicked more openly now, no longer pretending to be discreet. Grace felt the moment crystallize. This was no longer a gala, it was a courtroom, and the jury was the entire city. Eleanor placed both hands flat on the podium, her shoulders squared. "This conversation is over," she declared, her voice final, her gaze sweeping across the room like a blade. But the spell was broken. Conversations sparked at every table, phones lit up with texts, tweets, calls. Donors who had built their reputations on Harrington prestige now weighed whether to cut ties before reputations burned. Grace knew the night had tipped. The truth was out, and though Eleanor might command silence, she could not command forgetting. Ethan met Grace's eyes one last time before turning away. His face pale but resolute. For the first time, he looked less like a pawn and more like a man ready to play his own game. The ballroom had scattered like glass after a stone. Guests excused themselves to the lobby, donors retreated to the bar, and the once pristine event cracked into smaller conversations, each carrying its own current of rumor. But near the stage, Under the weight of the chandeliers and the gaze of a dozen discreet cameras, Grace remained. She had not planned to be the center, but the center had found her, and she could no longer retreat. Eleanor had left the podium with Whitmore at her side, both moving toward the anteroom behind the curtains, their expressions tight as a door slammed against its hinges. Ethan lingered nearby, frozen halfway between his mother's gravity and Grace's momentum, his hands flexing like he might speak again, but didn't yet know how. The silence pressed against Grace like a physical force, daring her to either collapse or push forward. A microphone still stood abandoned at the podium, its red light glowing faintly like an ember refusing to die. Grace walked toward it slowly, each step echoing across marble like a verdict. The string quartet shuffled awkwardly, one musician whispering, "Are we supposed to play?" The conductor shook his head, his bow hand trembling. Grace reached the podium and wrapped her fingers around the cool metal. Her palms were damp, her heart an unsteady drum, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "I have worked for this family for 8 years," she began, eyes sweeping across the room, "long enough to know every corner of this house, every room polished until it gleams, every stain hidden where guests won't see." She paused, letting the metaphor sink, letting the words resonate with both marble and memory. But houses are like people. You can hide the dust for a while, but sooner or later, it clogs the air. A murmur spread among the guests who hadn't yet fled. Some nodded almost unconsciously, compelled by the resonance of the image. Grace continued, her voice rising just enough to carry. "When I first found the box, I thought it was a mistake, something forgotten, left behind. But what I held in my hands was not dust, it was proof. Proof that love had been erased from history because it was inconvenient. Proof that money moved in shadows so the Harrington name could stay polished under the lights." She felt her throat tighten but forced herself to push on. "And when you clean up after people long enough, you start to see the things they no longer notice. You see the fingerprints, the stains, the cracks, and you learn what's hidden is often more important than what shines." At the back of the room, Whitmore reappeared, flanked by 2 men in security uniforms. His voice carried across the ballroom like a whip. "That's enough, Miss Miller." He gestured toward her, but the guards hesitated, unsure whether they were escorting out a trespasser or silencing a whistleblower in full view of half the city's elite. Grace turned toward him, not stepping down, her voice sharpening into steel. "You can shut off microphones. You can order men to drag me away, but you can't erase what's already been seen. You can't unspeak what's already been spoken." The guests buzzed again, the current of sympathy shifting like a tide. Ethan stepped forward then, surprising even himself, and spoke loud enough for the microphone to catch. "She's right. We all deserve to hear her. If this family truly values integrity, then it should start by letting her speak." That declaration hung in the air, heavier than Eleanor's speech, more dangerous than Whitmore's denial. The guards froze under the weight of conflicting commands. Ethan's voice carried the gravity of airship, and their loyalty frayed. Whitmore's face reddened, his carefully maintained composure cracking into fury. Eleanor's voice cut through sharp and final. "Ethan, step away, now!" But Ethan didn't. Ow! He planted himself between Grace and the men Whitmore had summoned, his posture unshaken for once. His storm-grey eyes carrying the quiet fire of a man who had finally chosen his side. "If the Harrington name means anything," he said, "it can survive truth. What it cannot survive is silence." Grace inhaled deeply, grounding herself in that sudden sliver of support. Her voice softened, not to diminish, but to draw people in. "When I cleaned your library," she said, glancing toward Eleanor, "I saw first editions on shelves no one touched. When I scrubbed your silver, I polished reflections you never looked into. And when I swept your halls, I carried whispers you thought no one heard. I am invisible until you need things to shine, but invisibility does not mean ignorance." Her gaze swept across the guests, many of whom now leaned forward, caught between discomfort and fascination. I know what love looks like when it's erased. I know what corruption smells like when it's hidden. And I know what fear sounds like when powerful people hear their own secrets spoken aloud. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, restless, almost trembling. Even those who had once dismissed her as background now studied her as if she had turned into a mirror, reflecting things they would rather not see. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, her lips pressed into a line thin enough to cut. Whitmore whispered something harsh to her, but she shook her head minutely, calculation flickering across her features. For the first time, Eleanor Harrington did not look untouchable. She looked cornered. Grace felt the weight of every year she had spent unseen settle into this moment, and she chose not to flinch. "You can ignore me," she said quietly, her voice carrying anyway. "But you cannot ignore what's in that box, and the longer you try, the louder it will echo." Ethan's breath came shaky, but firm. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice now joining hers. "I think we've all heard enough to know there's more to this story than speeches about legacy. We owe it to ourselves and to this city to bring it into the light." The guests erupted in mixed reactions. Some applauded tentatively, some gasped, some reached for their phones. But the tide had shifted irreversibly. Grace stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding but her resolve like stone. She had spoken. She had become visible, and nothing in that golden ballroom could put her back in the shadows. The night after the gala felt heavier than any storm, though the skies over Manhattan remained clear. In the Harrington Estates library, oak shelves whispered of old secrets while Eleanor and Whitmore paced like caged lions. The faint smell of cigar smoke clung to the drapes, though no one had lit one in years. A single lamp burned, casting shadows that made Eleanor's emerald gown look darker, like a funeral robe. "She humiliated us," Eleanor said, her voice low, deliberate, dangerous. "In front of donors, in front of the press. If one photograph leaks, if one recording reaches the wrong inbox, decades of Harrington legacy will unravel overnight." Whitmore's jaw flexed as he tapped ash into an empty glass. "Legacy isn't the problem. Containment is. We silence Miller before she moves from rumor to documentation." But in a quiet apartment across town, Grace had already passed the point of silence. At Mrs. O'Donnell's kitchen table, she slid the small pen drive from her tote, found taped inside the shoebox lid, overlooked by Whitmore's careful eyes, and connected it to the old laptop that whirred like a tired clock. The files bloomed on the screen, emails between Whitmore and offshore contacts, spreadsheets detailing transfers through Bayshore Holdings, invoices for donations that never reached charities. Margaret gasped softly, the tea in her mug trembling. "This isn't speculation, Grace. This is theft in suits." Grace's hands tightened on the keyboard. "It's more than theft. It's the Foundation's reputation. Money meant for sick children, diverted to keep Laura Bennett and her child invisible." She glanced at Ethan, who sat at the table too, pale, trembling, his storm-grey eyes wide with something between horror and relief. "That child was me," he whispered, the realization no longer theory but fact carved in digital ink. Ethan leaned forward, scrolling through the files as though touching proof might steady him. "My father tried to protect her. That's why the box exists. He couldn't stop Whitmore. He couldn't fight my mother, so he left breadcrumbs." His voice broke, but he steadied it with effort. "And all this time, I thought I was just wrong. Wrong in this family, wrong in this name. But it wasn't me. It was the lie." Grace reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Lies can cage you, Ethan, but truth breaks locks. The price, though—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Margaret did it for her. The price is that truth doesn't come cheap. It demands skin, sometimes blood. The room fell into silence again, broken only by the laptop's faint fan and the tick of the old wall clock counting down to morning. The knock on the door at midnight was sharp, official. Grace stiffened, but Margaret moved first, opening it just enough to reveal a man in a charcoal suit with glasses perched low on his nose. He held up a badge. "Michael Rivera, New York Times," he said, voice calm but urgent. "I was tipped that someone had documents linking Whitmore to Foundation fraud. If that's true, you have a decision to make. Go public with me and have protection, or wait and watch him bury you." Grace exchanged a glance with Ethan. His breath came shallow, his fists clenched on the table. "If we give this to the press now, there's no undoing it," Grace said slowly. Rivera nodded. "That's the point. Once light touches these files, shadows can't reclaim them." Ethan's voice cut through the air. "Do it." His tone was iron now, forged by a lifetime of doubt collapsing into certainty. "If my father tried to leave proof, then it was meant to be seen. I won't let his last attempt at honesty rot in a box." Grace hesitated, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. She thought of Eleanor's cold eyes, Whitmore's threats, the way powerful people twisted courts and contracts into weapons. She also thought of Laura Bennett's photograph, of a woman whose love had been struck from history, of a child who had grown into a man suffocating under lies. With trembling fingers, she copied the files to Rivera's encrypted drive. "Then the truth leaves this room tonight," she said. Rivera exhaled, shoulders loosening. "You just changed the morning news cycle, and maybe history." Across town, Eleanor received the first alert from a donor's assistant, journalist sniffing around, asking about Bayshore. Her hand clenched around her glass of scotch until it cracked, amber spilling onto the Persian rug. Whitmore cursed under his breath, already dialing contacts. "He'll publish by dawn if he has anything solid. We'll bury him in injunctions, gag orders, NDAs. Eleanor cut him off, her voice raw with rage. "Do it. But if Ethan is involved—" She didn't finish, because finishing meant acknowledging that the son she had sculpted into an heir might now become the hammer that broke her empire. Outside, the estate's manicured lawns glowed under security floodlights, pristine and silent, while inside its walls, panic spread like fire through velvet. By 5 a.m., the first article draft landed in Rivera's inbox. Headline: "Harrington Foundation linked to offshore fraud. CFO Whitmore named." Grace read it over his shoulder in the dim light of Margaret's kitchen. Each line tightened her chest. The figures, the shell companies, the missing millions. "They'll call me a liar," she said softly. "They'll call you worse," Rivera replied, "but they can't call this fabricated. It's in their own words, their own numbers. That's what kills empires. Not gossip, not rumor, receipts." Ethan stood by the window, watching dawn edge the sky in pale gold. His reflection looked older already, as if truth had added years overnight. "Then let it burn," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "If this is the price, we pay it. But we don't hide anymore." The article was scheduled for release at 7 a.m. Grace sat back, exhaustion washing over her, but beneath it a clarity she had never known. Margaret poured another round of tea, muttering, "If they come for us, let them. They'll find women with stronger spines than they bargained for." Outside, the first birds began to sing, unaware of the storm that would break by breakfast. Grace looked at Ethan and saw not just the boy who had been hidden, but the man choosing to step into daylight. "The truth is out there now," she whispered, "and once it's seen, it can't be unseen." Ethan nodded, the storm-grey eyes finally steady. "And neither can I." The morning broke with headlines louder than any alarm clock. Newsstands from Boston to Washington carried Rivera's article in bold black ink. "Harrington Foundation tied to offshore fraud. CFO Whitmore under fire." The words ran across glossy front pages, flickered on TV screens in coffee shops, blared from car radios in traffic jams. At the estate in Greenwich, Eleanor Harrington sat rigid at the breakfast table, her emerald robe drawn tightly around her as though cloth alone could keep a dynasty intact. Her phone buzzed non-stop, donors demanding answers, board members threatening resignations, lawyers offering strategies that sounded more like triage than solutions. Across from her, Ethan sat in silence, his coffee untouched, his storm-grey eyes fixed not on the newspaper but on her. "It's over, Mother," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight it had never carried before. "The name you tried to protect has already been rewritten." Whitmore stormed in moments later, tie crooked, face slick with panic. "We can still contain this," he insisted, dropping a stack of legal briefs on the table. Injunctions, counterclaims, a public statement about forgery. Eleanor cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Enough. Containment is dead. What we face now is survival." She turned her gaze on Ethan, her tone both icy and pleading. "You don't understand what this family has built. The Harrington name isn't just money, it's influence, networks, decades of credibility. One article can't erase that unless we allow it to." Ethan's voice rose, brittle but fierce. "It wasn't one article that ruined us. It was decades of lies, lies you condoned, lies you let Whitmore orchestrate. And if you want to talk about what the name means, maybe it's time it meant something honest for once." In the library, under the weight of oil paintings of stern ancestors, Ethan and Eleanor confronted one another as though every generation of Harringtons watched from gilded frames. Grace stood quietly at the edge of the room, notebook in hand, her presence still unexpected in these halls. Eleanor's eyes snapped to her. "And you," she said bitterly, "the maid who thinks she's a savior, you've destroyed a family." Grace met her gaze without flinching. "I didn't destroy your family. I revealed what was already rotting. You can build a house on marble, Mrs. Harrington, but if the foundation is termites, it collapses on its own." Whitmore sneered, his voice dripping venom. "You think you've won, Miss Miller. Do you really believe the world will choose your word over ours?" Grace pulled the pen drive from her pocket and set it on the desk between them. "It's not my word anymore. It's yours. Your emails, your transfers, your signatures. The world doesn't need to believe me. It just needs to read you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor's face drained of color. Whitmore's jaw tightened like a vice. Ethan reached for the pen drive, turning it in his hands as though holding proof of his own existence. "Laura Bennett," he said softly, more to himself than to them. "She was never a ghost. She was my mother, and Father tried to give me a place in this story, but you erased it." He looked at Eleanor, his voice breaking. "You erased her." For the first time, Eleanor's composure cracked. Her eyes glistened, her lips trembled, but the apology stuck like glass in her throat. I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "Protecting us all." Ethan shook his head. "You weren't protecting us. You were protecting the lie." Outside, cameras had begun to gather at the estate gates, reporters shouting questions through iron bars, their voices carrying over the manicured lawns. Inside, decisions were being carved like epitaphs. Whitmore's phone rang, but this time Eleanor didn't let him answer. "You've brought us to ruin," she said coldly, her tone now directed at him. "This house will not fall for your benefit." For once, Whitmore looked rattled. He sputtered, "You were complicit, don't forget that." But Eleanor's eyes burned with something new, survival through sacrifice. "Perhaps, but the world needs a scapegoat, and it won't be my blood." She turned her back on him, leaving the CFO to feel the walls closing in. Grace caught the flicker of realization on his face. The empire he thought untouchable had chosen him as its offering. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood with Grace by the window overlooking the estate gardens. The hedges were still perfectly clipped, the fountains still ran, but the illusion of permanence had cracked. "Everything looks the same," he said softly, "but nothing is." Grace touched the glass lightly, her reflection overlapping his. "That's the thing about truth," she said. "It doesn't always change the view, but it changes how you see it." Ethan turned to her, his expression a mix of gratitude and grief. "What happens now? The Harrington legacy, what does it mean after this?" Grace's eyes held his steadily. "That depends on what you do with it. You can keep polishing the name, or you can rebuild it, not for donors, not for appearances, but for the people who've been invisible until now." Ethan's throat tightened, but he nodded. For the first time, the heir looked less like a victim of silence, and more like a man ready to create a legacy, not borrowed but earned. That evening, the Harrington Foundation announced Whitmore's resignation pending investigation. Though the world knew resignation was a polite word for exile, Eleanor appeared at a hastily arranged press conference, her emerald dress replaced by sober black, speaking of commitment to transparency with a voice stripped of grandeur. But the cameras lingered not on her, nor on the family crest behind her, but on Ethan, standing beside her. No longer a silent pawn, but a figure whose eyes promised a new narrative. Watching from the back of the room, Grace felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. The Harrington Empire might never recover its spotless shine, but perhaps it didn't need to. Perhaps legacies weren't meant to be polished until flawless. Perhaps they were meant to carry scars, to remind those who inherited them that truth had a price and that silence had an even higher one. The Harrington estate stood quieter than it had in decades. The gala lights had dimmed, the reporters had thinned, and the polished marble halls no longer echoed with untouchable certainty. Grace walked through the back gardens at dusk, the air cool and carrying the faint sweetness of magnolias. For the first time, she wasn't carrying a caddy, wasn't checking for streaks on glass or dust on shelves. She carried only herself, and the knowledge that truth, once spoken, cannot be taken back. Inside, Ethan was meeting with lawyers, board members, and donors, no longer the boy lost in gilded shadows, but a man stepping into a legacy defined not by lies, but by scars turned into lessons. Grace paused by the fountain, the water catching the last light of evening, and let herself reflect. "All these years I thought invisibility was safety," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the trickling water. "But maybe being invisible only keeps you safe until the world forgets you exist. And then, who are you protecting?" Her thoughts wandered to Laura Bennett, to a love erased, to a child hidden in plain sight, to Eleanor, clinging to a polished image until the shine cut her hands, and to Ethan, who had finally chosen truth over silence. Every life in this story carried a cost, but perhaps the cost was the very proof that they had lived it honestly, at last. The scandal would fade from headlines. Eventually, another empire would fall, another dynasty would fracture, and the world would scroll forward. But Grace knew this story wasn't just about the Harringtons. It was about every person who had ever been told their voice didn't matter, every worker whose truth was hidden behind polished walls, every invisible presence who carried burdens without acknowledgement. The Harringtons' empire might be stained forever, but for once, those stains weren't hidden. They were seen, named, and remembered, and that, Grace thought, was a kind of justice no one could launder away. As night fell, Ethan found her by the fountain. "Grace," he said quietly, "you've changed everything, not just for me, but for the Harrington name." She looked at him, her smile tired but resolute. "I didn't change it," she corrected softly. The truth did. I only gave it a voice. They stood together in the twilight, no longer maid and heir, but two people bound by the courage to face what others had buried. And in that silence, Grace felt something she hadn't in years: peace, not because the fight was over, but because she had chosen not to hide from it. She turned once more toward the viewer, the listener of this story, and her voice, though imagined, seemed to carry beyond the Harrington estate. What about you? What truths have you hidden because you thought no one would listen? What part of your story deserves to be spoken, even if it shakes the ground beneath your feet? The question lingered like a challenge, like a spark meant to ignite something in whoever carried it forward. And then, the final invitation, soft but insistent. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments what moment struck your heart the most. And if you believe in voices like Grace's, voices that refuse to stay invisible, then you belong here with us. Subscribe now, because every single day a new story waits for you. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next.